You need to tell me the truth right now!
I don't know what you're talking about.
You can't keep hiding it from everyone.
Hey! Step away from her right now or I'm calling security.
The bell above the diner door didn't just ring, it rattled, high and sharp, as if the brass itself knew what was coming through the frame. Outside, the rain was coming down in long, gray sheets, blurring the streetlights into smudges of yellow grease. It was 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, the kind of hour when the city doesn't sleep so much as it collapses into a hard, fitful dream. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee, fry grease, and old bleach, the signature scent of the Silver Spoon Diner, a place that had been 20 minutes away from closing for the last 30 years. Behind the counter stood Clara. She was 24, wearing a faded navy apron that was 3 sizes too big and sneakers with soles so thin she could feel every crack in the linoleum floor. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, practical bun, not a single strand loose, and her hands were moving with the quiet, practiced economy of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Wipe the laminate, rinse the rag, stack the thick ceramic mugs. To anyone passing by, she was just another tired face surviving on minimum wage and cold coffee, invisible to the world, the kind of person people looked right through when they wanted a late-night burger. They didn't see the way her weight shifted instantly when the door slammed open, dropping 2 inches into her heels, her center of gravity settling like lead into the floorboards. They didn't see the slight rotation of her left hip, or the way her thumb sat lightly over her knuckles, not clenched, but ready. They didn't know about the quiet room 3 miles away, where the floor was covered in worn canvas mats, or the 12 years of sweat, blood, and bruised ribs that had earned her the faded black belt tucked neatly in the bottom drawer of her closet. They just saw a girl with a wet rag and a name tag that said Clara. The 3 men who stepped out of the storm were not looking for food. You could tell by the way they occupied space, loud, heavy, and deliberately taking up more room than they needed. The tallest one, a guy with a thick neck and a leather jacket that smelled of stale beer and damp dog, shoved the door back until the glass slapped hard against the wall. His friends followed, laughing at something private and cruel. They were the kind of men who fed on the smallness of others, the kind who mistook silence for weakness and patience for fear. "We're closed for kitchen orders, guys," Clara said, her voice steady, low, and completely flat. It wasn't an invitation, it was a boundary. She didn't look up immediately, continuing to wipe down the edge of the register. "Pots are cold. I can get you coffee to go, but that's about it." The leader, the one the others called Mark, snorted, pulling out a stool that scraped against the tile with a sound like a dentist's drill. He didn't sit on it properly, he straddled it, leaning his elbows onto the counter, invading her workspace until he was less than 2 feet from her face. "Did I ask if the kitchen was open, sweetheart? I don't remember asking." In the back corner booth, the only other customer in the diner, an elderly man named Arthur who had been coming here since the 70s, shrank down into his vinyl seat. His hands trembled as he gripped his plastic spoon, his eyes fixed firmly on his lukewarm soup. Clara caught the movement out of the corner of her eye. That was the first thing they taught you at the dojo, long before they taught you how to strike or how to break a hold, awareness. You don't just see the threat, you see the room. You see the exits, the obstacles, and the innocent people who might get caught in the collateral damage. "Coffee," Clara repeated, her voice dropping another register, stripped of all customer service sweetness. "To go." Mark laughed, a wet, barking sound, and reached out. His fingers snapped against the laminated tent sign on the counter, knocking it over. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, girl. You think you're too good to make us some food? Look at this place. You're working the graveyard shift at a grease trap. You aren't too good for anything." One of his buddies, a guy with a shaved head and a scar across his chin, leaned over Mark's shoulder. "Hey, Mark, check her out. She's kinda cute when she's mad. Maybe she can show us where the private booth is in the back." The air in the diner changed. It became dense, heavy with the unmistakable charge of impending violence. For most people, that charge brings a spike of panic, a racing heart, dry mouth, shaking fingers. But for Clara, the change felt familiar. It was the same air that filled the dojo before a tournament match, the moment after the referee calls Hajime and before the first kick lands. Her pulse actually slowed down. Her breath deepened, filling her diaphragm, steadying her frame. She looked directly into Mark's eyes for the first time. There was no anger in her face, no fear, and no defiance. There was only absolute, terrifying clarity. "You need to leave," she said quietly. Mark's smile vanished. Aggressors like him don't know what to do with absolute calm. They expect flinching. They expect tears or pleading or nervous laughter. When they get stillness, it feels like an insult. He reached across the counter, his large, thick hand darting out to grab the collar of her navy apron, aiming to pull her across the formica surface and break her composure once and for all. He was fast for a heavy guy, but to Clara, his movement looked like it was happening underwater. She didn't pull back. Pulling back was what victims did. Instead, she stepped into the reach. Her left hand came up, open-palmed, striking the inside of his wrist with precision, deflecting his grip just an inch to the side, enough to miss her collar completely. In the same fluid motion, her right hand swept under his arm, her palm driving upward into the nerve cluster just below his armpit. It wasn't a showy move. It didn't look like something out of a movie. It was just mechanics, physics, and anatomy applied with cold efficiency. Mark gasped, a sharp intake of air as his right arm went instantly numb, dropping uselessly to his side. He stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him over the counter, his chest slamming against the metal napkin dispenser. The noise slammed through the empty diner like a gunshot. "What the hell?" the shaved head guy yelled, taking a step forward, his hands coming up out of his pockets. "Don't," Clara said. She hadn't moved her feet from her stance. Her left foot was forward, her weight balanced 60-40, her arms relaxed at her waist, fingers loosely curled. She wasn't breathing hard. He tripped. "Pick him up and get out." Mark was red-faced now, the shock turning instantly into blinding rage. The numbness in his arm was fading into a deep, throbbing ache, but his pride was hurt far worse than his body. He backed up, clutching his shoulder, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You crazy bitch. You think you can touch me?" He turned to his two friends, his voice cracking with humiliation. "Grab her. Drag her out from behind that counter." This was the moment where choices vanished. Clara had spent 12 years learning that martial arts was a path of peace, a discipline designed to prevent conflict, to preserve life, to build character. Her master, an old man named Sensei Tanaka who had spent his youth in Okinawa, had told her over and over, the ultimate goal of karate lies not in victory or defeat, but in the perfection of the character of its participants. You fight only when there is no other path. Looking at the three men blocking the exit, looking at old Arthur cowering in the corner, Clara knew the other paths were gone. The third guy, a taller, leaner man who had stayed quiet until now, moved first. He tried to flank the counter, reaching for the hinged wooden door that led into the kitchen area. Clara didn't wait for him to open it. She vaulted over the counter, her hands planting on the polished surface, her legs swinging through the air in a clean, effortless arc. She landed silently on the tile, right between the tall guy and the kitchen entrance. Before he could set his feet, Clara delivered a lightning-fast front snap kick directly to the meat of his thigh. It was a low kick, targeted at the femoral nerve, a strike designed to deaden the leg without causing permanent damage. The guy's leg folded under him instantly, his vocal cord catching in his throat as he dropped to one knee, clutching his leg in agony. "One," Clara said softly, her eyes already locking onto the shaved head guy. Shaved head panicked. He swung a wild, telegraphed right hook aimed straight at her face. It was the kind of punch thrown by someone who had only ever fought people who were afraid of him. Clara didn't even duck, she simply leaned back 3 inches, letting the fist whistle past her nose, catching the draft of his dirty jacket. As his arm overextended, she stepped inside his guard, her shoulder driving into his chest while her hand trapped his elbow. With a sharp, leveraged twist, she used his own momentum to send him airborne. He hit the linoleum hard, the wind knocking out of him with a loud, pathetic whoosh. The diner's salt shakers rattled on the nearby tables. It had taken less than 10 seconds. 2 men were on the floor, groaning, and Mark was left standing alone near the doorway, his jaw hanging open, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. The rain continued to lash against the glass behind him, but inside, the only sound was the hum of the ice machine and the heavy, ragged breathing of the men on the floor. What the hell are you? Mark stammered, taking a step backward until his shoulder hit the glass door. His hands were shaking now. The arrogant predator had vanished, replaced by a terrified boy who had realized he was trapped in a cage with something he couldn't comprehend. "I'm the waitress," Clara said, taking one calm, measured step toward him. "And you owe $8 for the coffee you didn't order." Mark didn't reach for his wallet. He fumbled frantically behind his back for the door handle, his eyes darting between Clara and his 2 friends who were struggling to stand up. "You're crazy. You're a freak," he spat, finally finding the latch. He shoved the door open, the wet wind rushing into the diner, and bolted out into the dark night, leaving his companions behind. The 2 men on the floor didn't bother trying to fight. The shaved head guy crawled backward toward the door, his eyes wide with horror, while the tall one limped heavily, using the jukebox to support his weight. Within seconds, they were both out in the storm, scrambling into a beaten-up black sedan that sped away down the slick asphalt, tires screeching into the darkness. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the red taillights fade into the mist. She took a deep breath, smelling the cool, wet air, allowing her heart rate to return to its resting rhythm. Then, she turned around, closed the door, and flipped the sign from open to closed. In the corner, Arthur slowly raised his head from his soup bowl. His mouth was slightly open, his hands still trembling, but not from fear anymore. From sheer, unadulterated awe. "Clara," he whispered, his voice raspy. Where did you learn to do that?" Clara picked up her wet rag from the counter, walked over to a nearby table, and began wiping down a spot of spilled syrup as if nothing had happened. "My dad," she said quietly, her voice softening for the first time all night. "He owned a dojo downtown." "Owned?" Arthur asked gently. Clara paused, her hand stopping mid-wipe. Her mind drifted back, not to the fight that had just ended, but to 6 months ago. To the quiet hospital room with the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. To the faded black belt resting on the bedside table, and the final words her father had whispered to her before his breath gave out. "A belt only holds up your pants, Clara," he had told her, his voice faint, dry as paper. "What holds up your soul is how you treat the people who can't fight for themselves. Never use strength to conquer. Use it to protect." When her father died, the dojo went with him. The medical bills had piled up like autumn leaves, swallowing his savings, his equipment, and eventually, the lease on the building that had been Clara's home since she was 5 years old. She had taken the graveyard shift at the Silver Spoon not because she wanted to, but because it paid just enough to cover the interest on the debts he had left behind, while allowing her to train in the empty parks during the day. She had given up her dreams of competing nationally. She had given up the lightweight competition team. She was just trying to survive, trying to keep her head above water in a city that didn't care about honor or tradition. "Yeah," Clara told Arthur, resuming her work with the rag. "He passed away last year." Arthur nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind her words. "He taught you well, kid. He taught you real well." The rest of the night passed in quiet monotony. Clara cleaned the kitchen, mopped the floors, counted the register down to the last cent, and locked the front door at 4 in the morning. When she walked out into the cool morning air, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets wet and reflective, mirroring the neon lights of the sleeping city. She pulled her hoodie up over her head and walked the 8 blocks back to her tiny studio apartment, her muscles aching not from the brief scuffle, but from the emotional exhaustion that always followed a confrontation. She hated violence. That was the secret most people didn't understand about martial arts. The better you were at it, the more you hated using it, because you understood better than anyone how fragile the human body really was. One wrong angle, 1 inch to the left, and a strike didn't just stop an attacker, it ruined a life forever. When she reached her apartment building, she climbed the 3 flights of squeaking stairs and unlocked her door. The room was tiny, holding only a narrow twin bed, a wooden desk, and a single closet. On top of the desk sat a framed photograph of her and her father standing on the mats after she had passed her Shodan exam at age 16. He had his arm around her shoulders, both of them drenched in sweat, grinning like fools. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, unlacing her sneakers. She looked at her hands, short nails, calloused knuckles, a faint scar on her palm from an old sparring injury. She thought about Mark's eyes, the sudden shift from cruelty to terror, and felt a strange, cold pit in her stomach. Something told her that night wasn't over. Men like Mark didn't just learn a lesson and walk away into the night. Pride wounded in front of friends was a poisonous thing. It rotted inside a person until it turned into something much worse than simple aggression. She was right. 2 days later, Clara was back on the shift. It was a Thursday night, slightly busier than usual. A couple of truckers sat at the counter eating chicken fried steak, and a young family was in a booth near the window, finishing up pancakes. Clara was behind the counter, pouring fresh coffee, when she felt a familiar prickle at the back of her neck. She looked up. Standing outside the glass window, across the wet street, was the black sedan from Tuesday night. The engine was idling, thin white smoke rising from the exhaust pipe into the night air. Through the rain-streaked windshield, she could see the silhouette of a man. It wasn't Mark. It was someone bigger, wider, sitting in the passenger seat with his head turned toward the diner. Clara kept pouring the coffee, her hand steady, but her mind began calculating immediately. The diner was full of civilians tonight, 2 truckers, a mother, a father, and a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. If those men came inside with weapons, if they brought the fight back into this room, she wouldn't be able to protect everyone. The spatial geometry was wrong. There were too many obstacles, too many potential hostages. She set the coffee pot down, walked over to her manager, a tired middle-aged woman named Brenda who was sitting in the small back office working on inventory. "Brenda," Clara said softly, keeping her voice entirely free of panic. "I need to take my break early tonight. Just 15 minutes. Brenda looked up from her spreadsheet, rubbing her tired eyes. "Now." "Clara, the rush is just winding down." "Please," Clara insisted. "Just 15 minutes. I'll cover the closing cleanup entirely by myself." Brenda sighed, waving a hand dismissively. "Fine, fine. Go smoke a cigarette or whatever you kids do. But don't be late back." Clara didn't smoke. She walked back to the employee alcove near the kitchen, took off her apron, and folded it neatly on a shelf. Beneath it, she was wearing a fitted black long-sleeved shirt and black athletic pants, her default attire for walking home late at night. She pushed open the back door of the diner, stepping out into the narrow, dimly lit alleyway that ran behind the building. The alley smelled of damp cardboard and old iron. It was lined with heavy steel dumpsters and lit by a single flickering security light high on the brick wall. Clara took 3 steps into the alley, then stopped. "I wondered if you'd be smart enough to come out the back," a voice called out from the darkness. Mark stepped out from behind a large yellow dumpster, his hands jammed into his leather jacket pockets. But he wasn't alone. From the other end of the alley, blocking the street exit, walked the 2 men from Tuesday night. And standing right beside Mark was a 4th man, a giant of a guy, easily 6'4", with shoulders like a draft horse and a heavy iron tire iron hanging loosely from his right hand. "You really thought you were something, didn't you?" Mark sneered, his voice dripping with malice. He looked different tonight, his eyes were bloodshot, his jaw set in a hard, vengeful line. You humiliated me in front of my boys. You think a little girl playing karate gets to walk away from that? Clara looked at the four men, then at the exits. Both were blocked. The walls of the alley were 3 stories high, smooth brick with no fire escapes within reach. The ground was wet, covered in a slick sheen of oil and rain. Mark, Clara said, her voice remaining low and steady, though her senses were heightened to an absolute peak. This doesn't have to go any further. You left the diner. It was over. Go home. It's not over until I say it's over. Mark yelled, his voice echoing off the narrow brick walls. He gestured to the massive guy with the tire iron. This is my older brother, Greg. He doesn't play karate, sweetheart. He played college football, and he breaks things for a living. Show her what happens when people mess with our family, Greg. Greg didn't speak. He didn't laugh or make a speech. He was a professional bully, the kind of man who used raw mass and heavy steel to intimidate people. He took 2 steps forward, dragging the tire iron along the damp brick wall, producing a terrible, grinding metallic screech that sent shivers down the spine. Clara took a slow, deep breath, letting the tension melt out of her shoulders, letting her hips drop into her base stance. In her mind, she heard her father's voice once more, when you are outnumbered, you do not fight 4 men. You fight 1 man 4 times. Control the distance, control the timing, and use their own weight against them. Greg charged. He didn't bother with technique, he relied on sheer momentum, raising the heavy tire iron high above his head to bring it down in a crushing vertical blow that would have shattered a person's shoulder. Clara didn't step back. Stepping back into an enclosed alley meant getting trapped against a wall. She stepped forward and to the left, angling inside the arc of the heavy weapon. The tire iron whistled past her right ear, missing her by less than an inch, and slammed into the wet asphalt with a shower of sparks. Before Greg could reset his posture, Clara planted her right foot, pivoted on her heel, and threw a devastating Ushiro Jerry, a spinning back kick. Her heel struck Greg squarely in the center of his chest, right on the sternum. The force of the strike, combined with his own forward momentum, drove all the air out of his lungs in a sickening gasp. The giant stumbled backward 3 steps, his boots sliding through the puddle, his eyes wide with shock as he struggled to breathe. The shaved head guy and the tall guy didn't wait. Seeing their biggest man falter, they rushed Clara simultaneously from both sides. One pulled a short hunting knife from his belt, the other reached out with open hands, trying to tackle her to the ground. This was the moment of maximum danger. In a multiple attacker scenario, going to the ground was death. You had to stay on your feet at all costs. Clara focused on the man with the knife. As he lunged with a straight thrust toward her stomach, she executed a classic knife hand block, striking the inner side of his wrist with the hardened edge of her hand, deflecting the blade away from her body. In one continuous motion, her fingers wrapped around his wrist, her thumb pressing hard into the back of his hand, forcing his joints into an excruciating joint lock known as kotegaeshi. She twisted his wrist outward and down. The man screamed as his body was forced to rotate to relieve the pressure, dropping the knife onto the wet asphalt. Clara didn't let go, she used his falling body as a human shield, positioning him directly between herself and the third attacker who was coming in for a tackle. The third guy slammed directly into his own partner, both of them tumbling onto the wet ground in a chaotic heap of limbs. Clara stepped back instantly, disengaging, her hands coming up into a high guard position. She was breathing slightly faster now, a thin sheen of sweat on her forehead, but her eyes remained entirely focused, her body completely balanced. Greg had recovered his breath. He spat a mouthful of blood onto the pavement, his eyes burning with a dark, primal rage. He ignored the tire iron on the ground, reaching into his heavy coat pocket instead. When his hand came out, he wasn't holding a blunt weapon. He was holding a small, silver revolver. The metallic click of the hammer being pulled back sounded louder than a thunderclap in the narrow alleyway. That's enough. Greg growled, his hand shaking slightly with adrenaline and rage. That is enough. You're dead, you hear me? You think you're tough? Let's see you dodge this. Time seemed to slow down. Clara stood frozen, her eyes locked on the dark circle of the barrel pointed directly at her chest. This was the boundary of martial arts. No belt, no technique, no 12 years of practice could stop a lead bullet traveling at 900 feet per second. The grand illusion of human strength vanished in an instant, replaced by the cold, unyielding reality of a firearm. Mark laughed from behind his brother, a high, nervous, unhinged sound. Yeah. Shoot her, Greg. Shoot her. Clara lowered her hands slowly, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked into Greg's eyes. He wasn't a master murderer, he was a terrified, enraged man who had lost control of the situation and was now clinging to a gun to regain his sense of power. Greg, Clara said, her voice dropping to a gentle, steady murmur, stripped of all aggression. Look at me. Greg's finger tightened slightly on the trigger. Shut up. Look at me, she repeated softly. You shoot me, and your life is over. You're 30 years old. You have a family, maybe a job, a life outside this alley. You kill a waitress over a stupid bar fight your brother started, and you spend the rest of your life in a maximum security cell. Is Mark worth that? Greg hesitated, his breath ragged, his eyes flicking for a fraction of a second toward his younger brother. That fraction of a second was all the opening she needed. Clara didn't jump for the gun. She knew better than to rush a man with his finger on a trigger. Instead, she took a single, deliberate step to the side, dropping her body height by 6 inches, shifting her profile away from the direct line of fire. At the exact same instant, a loud, metallic slam echoed from the far end of the alley. Police! Drop the weapon, a booming voice roared through a bullhorn. A blinding white beam of light cut through the rain and darkness, illuminating Greg, Mark, and the 2 men scrambling on the ground. 2 marked police cruisers had pulled up to the entrance of the alley, their blue and red lights flashing wildly against the wet brick walls, painting the scene in surreal, vibrating color. Greg froze, the blinding light overwhelming his vision. The sudden arrival of authority shattered his fragile resolve. The gun slipped from his nervous, sweaty fingers, dropping with a dull thud onto the wet pavement. Within seconds, officers swarmed the alley, their weapons drawn, shouting commands. Greg and Mark were slammed against the cold brick wall, their hands yanked behind their backs, the hard click of handcuffs signaling the absolute end of their reign of terror. Clara stood still, her hands raised slightly, letting the officers verify she was not a threat. One of the officers, a seasoned female sergeant with gray hair tucked under her cap, walked up to Clara, looking her up and down, taking in the scene, 4 large men on the ground or in cuffs, and 1 young woman standing uninjured in the center of it all. You okay, young lady? The sergeant asked, her eyes wide with disbelief as she looked at the giant man being loaded into the back of a cruiser. Who called us? From behind the police cars, an old, stooped figure stepped out into the light, holding a thick wool coat tightly around his shoulders. It was Arthur. He walked slowly down the alley, his old knees stiff in the damp air, a faint, proud smile touching his weathered lips. I saw them following her out the back, Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. I knew what kind of men they were. So I called 911 from the payphone near the restrooms. Clara looked at the old man, her chest tightening with a profound, overwhelming wave of emotion. For months, she had felt completely alone in the world, fighting debts, working late nights, mourning her father, carrying the weight of her survival entirely on her own shoulders. She had spent her life learning how to protect others, never expecting anyone to protect her. She walked over to Arthur, stepping past the police lights, and wrapped her arms around the old man in a tight, quiet embrace. Arthur patted her back gently with his wrinkled hand. You don't always have to fight alone, Clara, Arthur whispered softly into her hair. Sometimes, the world steps up for you, too. An hour later, the alley was quiet again. The police cars had driven off, taking Mark, Greg, and their friends away into the legal system, where their history of violence and intimidation would finally catch up with them. The rain had ceased entirely, leaving behind a clear, starlit sky over the sleeping city. Clara walked back inside the diner. Brenda was standing near the register, looking pale and shaken after hearing the story from the police officers. She looked at Clara as if she were seeing a stranger, a mythical creature disguised in a faded navy apron. "Clara." Brenda stammered, her hands trembling as she held a dish towel. I had no idea. The police said, they said you handled 4 of them." Clara looked at her apron resting on the shelf. She picked it up, unfolded it, and tied it neatly around her waist once again. She smoothed down the fabric, stepping back behind the counter where the smell of burnt coffee and bleach still lingered. "I'm just a waitress, Brenda," Clara said with a quiet, genuine smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "I just know how to sweep the floor." She picked up her pot of coffee and walked over to Arthur's booth, pouring him a fresh, hot cup without him even having to ask. As the dark liquid filled the mug, steam rising into the quiet air of the diner, Clara looked out the big glass window at the quiet street. She realized then that her father hadn't just left her with debts and memories, he had left her with a gift that no amount of money could buy. True strength isn't measured by the battles you win or the opponents you knock down. It isn't found in the color of a belt or the power of a strike. True strength is the quiet courage to remain gentle in a hard world, to stand firm when the storm rages, and to know that even when you are walking in the darkest night, you are never truly alone.